Hi everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, From Punching Bag to Telecommunicator, Training Mistakes to Avoid when Developing Your Best Coworker. This training is brought to you by Commercial Electronics. If you would like to learn more about our recording solution and third-party quality assurance services, visit comelectronics.com. This webinar is part of our Public Safety Education Series, and you can view our upcoming webinars on our training page at comelectronics.com/training. Now, before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop. You're listening in using your computer's speaker system by default, and all attendees are automatically muted to eliminate background noise. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select the handset in the audio pane at the bottom right, and the dial-in information will be displayed. You'll have the opportunity to submit questions about today's lesson by typing your questions into the Q&A pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. I will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. The best time to send in your questions is when you think of them. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a survey on the presentation, and we'd appreciate it if you would complete that and let us know how we did so we can continue to provide you with relevant content. You'll also receive a follow-up email within 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. For those wanting to report this training to their state certification or licensing agency, send an email to training@comelectronics.com. My name is Beth English, and I'm your instructor today. I began my 911 career as a police dispatcher 31 years ago when I was 9 years old, and most recently served as a communications director before joining Commercial Electronics as the program manager for their QA/QI program and higher ground instructor. I have my master's telecommunicator license from Texas. I'm a TCOL instructor and a past president of Texas MENA. So let's get started with our session. The stories you are about to hear are true. The names and places have been changed to protect me. When I began my career in 911, slightly more than a couple of years ago, my first shift was the midnight shift, where I learned to answer the phones. I was then transferred to day shift to learn how to work the NCIC radio. While still on the day shift, I was moved to the main dispatch radio to train on it. Now, I had been training on this radio for 1 week when one day during patrol shift change, we had a huge storm come in and a massive accident occurred at a major intersection. My trainer chose that moment to leave the room and left me alone on the radio. I sank fast. I didn't recognize any of the oncoming shift's voices because I hadn't worked with them yet. I had officers checking in and out back to back, and I had officers checking en route but not telling me what they were en route to. It was a complete disaster. After about 15 minutes, my trainer came back in the room, took the keyboard away from me, and caught up everyone's status. Afterwards, she took me to the ladies' lounge and commenced chewing on me for the poor job I had done, telling me I was going to have to pick it up if I wanted to keep my job and that my DOR would reflect how badly I had done that day. I was devastated. I cried all the way home and started thinking of what other jobs I could do that I could start applying for. So does this sound familiar to any of you? Have you ever had this done to you? Have you ever done this to someone else? After I had children, I understood why some animals eat their young, but I've never understood why communication centers do. I don't know any other profession that treats their new people the way we do. And yes, I know it's not every agency, but it's enough that it's a well-known fact. We treat our trainees like punching bags. We take out our frustrations on them, making them pay for our bad attitudes, and basically doing what we can to eliminate them. It's a hard profession to break into, and it's our fault. What we should be doing is our very best to turn these trainees into our best coworkers. You're working in a comm center. You're at 60% capacity. You can't take your vacation or holiday time because you're so short-handed, and yet you're going to lose that time if you don't take it soon. Then someone new starts. Yippee! Finally, you're going to have some help. You might even get to take your RDOs. Do you know what RDOs are? When you hired this new employee, you followed all the right steps to get them hired. You processed the application, you did the testing, and then you called them to come in for an interview. In the interview, you explained everything about the job, beginning with everything that's difficult or undesirable. You told them how hard the job is. You told them about missing holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, and their kids' games. You emphasized the shift work and told them about having days off during the week for the next 150 years. Then you told them about the wonderful benefits, the importance of the job, and how they'll be saving lives and making a difference every day. You mentioned how the job is different from anything they've ever done and how no 2 days are ever the same. And then you talked about the public safety family and the brotherhood with the officers and the firefighters and the fellow telecommunicators. By the time you finished, the applicant was ready to start this wonderful job. When their first day came, they were excited and ready to get started. After 3 months on the job, they turned in their resignation. So what happened? Before I go on, let's take a quick survey. Okay, as a trainee, were you first required to read manuals before receiving any hands-on training? Yes or no? Okay, I'll give you a minute just to answer that. Right now it's looking like it's almost half and half. 52% of you say yes. Well, gone up a little bit more. So 56% of you say yes. So a lot of you went through this. You were given manuals first. And I'm not really talking about going through the academy. I'm talking about just given a manual and sat down and told to read. So mistake number one is inundating them with reading material. Oops. All right, so let's talk about this one. Imagine you're the trainee. On your first day, you went through some sort of orientation, you got a key card, a headset, a tour of the facility, and then you were assigned a trainer. For the rest of the day, you listened into some calls and observed the radio operator. And then when day 2 rolled around, the trainer handed you the NCIC manual, the SOP, and the department's general orders, and told you to go sit in the corner and read them. And for the next 3 weeks, you were left alone, ignored, while you read everything the trainer gave you. Some of you may not have to imagine this because it may have happened to you. Now let's say that you had no previous experience. So after spending the first day reading the NCIC manual, did you run home and tell your family, guess what? I learned today that NCIC is a computerized index of criminal justice information, i.e. criminal record history information, fugitive, stolen properties, and missing persons. What about the SOPs? Did you miraculously learn all the codes and acronyms in that first few weeks just from reading? Or did you sit there and think to yourself, WTF have I gotten myself into? For some reason, a lot of trainers think that the way to get a trainee to learn is by reading everything. Personally, I think it's just pure laziness. Now, granted, some people learn that way, but in my 30-something years in 911, I've never had someone tell me to just let them read the book because they learn better that way. The 2% of the population who can do this job learn by doing. They learn by physically carrying out the activities rather than by lecture, demonstration, or reading. So expecting someone to learn just by reading manuals full of acronyms that they've never heard before is unrealistic. And sadly, many agencies do that because they have always done it that way. And they wonder why they can't keep trainees. All I can say is stop it. Mistake number 2, not being ready. Part of welcoming a trainee to their new role is to have everything ready when they come on board. The first thing that must be done is getting them acquainted with the important places in the work environment. So you give them a tour of the coffee machine, you give them the creamer and sugar location and show them where the flavored syrups are. You show them the locker area, the manager's or chief's office, and the communications center. Then you get them an access card, an identification badge, and introduce them to their trainer. If the trainer does her job correctly, she starts explaining to the trainee how everything in the room works. She explains about the email system and payroll, shift assignment, and other pertinent day-to-day details. She'll then have the trainee do something easy, like log into his email, only to find that there's no email set up for him. Oops. So she takes a moment to call the supervisor and or manager to get that done, only to find out that the entire IT department is in training this week. So it'll be sometime next week before it can be done. Okay, let's move on. For those of you who have ever had to work with the CAD system down, you know how difficult it is to work without your computers. If you can't log into something when you walk in the door, you can't do anything. It's the same way with a trainee. If they can't log into their email, phone, or CAD system, the only thing they can do is read the manuals, and we've already had that discussion. So it's imperative that all or most of the technical access that they'll need has been set up prior to their first day. Now, with all the different systems in use in a comm center today, it's easy to forget something, so obviously you're going to need a checklist to go by when onboarding a new employee, and that's onboarding, not waterboarding. You want to make sure you have your main systems, such as email and phone, on the list, along with all the other logins you will need. Don't forget the state website logins, your NCIC, court systems, mass notification, etc. Some of the logins won't be available until after the trainee is started, and those need to be noted, but they also need to be available on the list so they aren't overlooked. Okay. Mistake number 3, failure to provide relevance. When the trainer finally gets around to working with the trainee, they tell them to start answering calls. And then as the caller describes their issue, the trainer tells the trainee to enter this here, click on that, double click on this, hit enter. And the trainee follows each step as given by the trainer for each call. So this continues on for several weeks until the trainee is able to process the steps for each call. But what's wrong with this picture? Is the trainee actually learning anything, or are they just learning the steps by rote? As a director, I've had trainees in communications who could enter a call with all the proper steps, but had no idea why they were asking for or entering the information. So when it hit the fan, they couldn't think on their feet because they only knew the motions, not the why. In order to be able to think through situations, trainees need relevance. Telling them what to do without telling them why they're doing it is setting them up for failure. It keeps them from actually learning rather than absorbing by osmosis. So explain what you're doing and why you're doing it so they have a point of reference to fall back on when they actually have to start thinking on their own. Mistake number 4, making the trainee your servant. Once the trainee has started answering the phones, somewhat on their own, the trainer shows the trainee how to enter wants, stolen, and missing in the NCIC. And for the next 6 to 8 weeks, The trainee enters everything. Now, the idea behind this is that the trainee needs the practice. So the trainee ends up doing all the jobs the trainer doesn't want to do, like entering warrants and the ever popular protective orders. In one agency, a trainee finally got so fed up with that, he told his trainer that he was no one's, well, you get the idea. The trainee finally revolted, as will others who feel they're being taken advantage of. So if you find yourself making your trainee into your servant, take a moment to rethink it. You're doing this to the detriment of your agency and yourself. Yes, they need the experience, but just because you've been there a couple of years or more doesn't mean that you too don't need the practice. Keep in mind, NCIC procedures change regularly. With all the new databases being added almost daily, no one can afford to sit back for a few months and let the trainee handle it all. You need to maintain your skills too, or trust me, audit time is not going to be kind to you. Mistake number 5, making the trainee drink from the fire hose. I remember when I was being trained, I learned in phases. I was strictly trained on the phones during my first phase. There was no NCIC added in until I got to phase 2. But back then, in the dark ages, we only had one computer in the room that accessed NCIC. Now, you've got NCIC access on just about every computer in the room. So call takers can run criminal histories and license plates and just about every other request officers can come up with. So trainees are now having to learn NCIC while still learning how to answer the phone. And add in E&D or other protocols on top of that, and they literally feel like they are drinking from the fire hose. It very quickly becomes overwhelming, and they start doubting themselves even earlier in the game than we old-timers did. There were times when I was training newbies that I felt like I was the one holding the fire hose. So I can only imagine how they felt being at the other end. When you're training someone, try to remember what it felt like when you were the one trying to learn all of that information yourself. You may have it all down now, but you didn't start out that way. So introduce things in phases. You may want that training signed off in 3 months because you've got a cruise coming up, but it's better to have a well-trained coworker than to have someone else leave because they were inundated with too much information. Mistake number 6, overtraining and undertraining. We all have those regular calls that come in daily. Calls that have already occurred like thefts, burglaries, alarm calls, accidents, things like that. So these are the calls that the trainee learns how to process pretty quickly. After 2 or 3 weeks, they're able to answer the non-emergency lines on their own. This is when the trainer should start to sit back a little and give them some room to handle the calls that they can. However, some trainers continue to listen in on every single call, often while standing over the shoulder of the trainee. And they'll tell the trainee what to enter, what button to click, what to ask the caller, even as the trainee is about to be released from training on that position. This is overtraining, and it's the result of an over-controlling trainer. They just don't want to let go. Some trainees are okay with this, but let's admit it, most of us are type A personalities, and having someone listen in to your calls while they're standing over your shoulder, it just ticks you off. It does the same thing to trainees. If you're training someone and you've given them relevance to each of their tasks, then give them some room and let them reason through things until or unless you see that they can't. Now, that doesn't mean to go all the way to the opposite side and undertrain. While some trainers like to hang on tight until the very end, others will tell the trainee once what to do for each call type and then sit back and offer no further help, leaving the trainee to figure it out on his own. Then, when the trainee does it wrong, they jump in to chastise him heavily and tells the supervisor or manager that he's not going to cut it. Remember my story at the beginning about being left on the radio? That is a great example of undertraining. So if you're a trainer and you see yourself in either of these descriptions, think very hard about how you are affecting not only the trainees, but also your agency. Can you make some changes in your training skills that would benefit all of you? Mistake number 7, talking too much. Have you ever tried to call your wireless provider's customer service and explain to them the issue you're having, except you can't get a word in edgewise because they're too busy reading instructions to you from the troubleshooting dialogue? Talking too much is another issue that happens with training that you want to avoid. And yes, I know, I've already told you about overtraining, but there's a difference between hanging on to control and talking so much that your trainee can't even interact with you. As you're giving your trainee instructions on what to do, how to do, and why to do, remember to breathe, take a sip of that flavored coffee, and give them a chance to clarify, ask, and demonstrate. You need the break, and they need to be able to cement their new knowledge in their mind. Mistake number 8, belittling the trainee. Several trainers that I've worked with in the past have told trainees that they aren't real people until they're released from training. Other dispatchers will absolutely refuse to talk to trainees until they prove themselves on the job. They belittle them, intimidate them, and basically make them think they're worthless. And the trainees don't want to ask questions because they're so intimidated. They learn early on that asking a question only brings more disdain from the old hats as well as the trainers. So how can someone train under those circumstances? As a trainer, it's your responsibility to not only train the new employees, but also to make sure that they're able to assimilate into the agency. So letting others talk down to them does a disservice to everyone. The trainees may be new to your agency, but they're still people, not puppets to be abused and used. They should be treated with respect, if for nothing else than passing the background. And even if the trainees aren't getting it, need to be treated with respect. But keep in mind that when someone leaves your agency because of the way they were treated, that becomes your agency's reputation, because they will go out and tell others about their experience. And if you think it's hard hiring people now, just let it get out there that you treat your new people like that, and no one will want to apply. One agency had such a bad reputation for the way they treated their new people that everyone in the area knew about it, and they couldn't recruit anyone with experience within a 150-mile radius. Think of how hard that made it to hire new people. Now, before we go on, let's do another quick survey. Okay. As a trainee, did you feel like you were bullied by others at your center? Okay. Most of y'all say no, but a big percentage of y'all say yes. Okay then. So let's talk about that. All right, mistake number 9 is bullying. If your trainees feel bullied, then you've got a problem. The trainers aren't actually training, and the trainees aren't actually learning. One agency had trouble keeping trainees and had lost every single one over a 2-year period. The officers in the agency called it the Viper Pit. When the new manager was hired, he was told there were problems that he needed to take care of. So he observed the trainees, the trainers, and the other employees and got a basic idea of what was happening, but he had no proof. Eventually, one of the trainees got fed up enough to go to him and spill the beans. The trainee reported that the trainer was bullying him in various ways. He gave examples of the trainer standing over him while he was taking non-emergency calls, interrupting him while he was talking to the caller. She was gossiping with officers about other dispatchers in front of him. She allowed officers to text requests to her on her personal cell phone because they didn't want to talk to him or any other trainee. She was doing ride-alongs on her nights off and complaining to patrol about the supervisors and her coworkers. And the officers would then take those complaints to their chain of command, whether they had any firsthand knowledge or not. In the meantime, they had a trainer on another shift who was talking down to her trainees, being so condescending that they refused to ask her any questions. If they couldn't ask someone else, they would just do it wrong rather than risk being talked down to in front of everyone. So, as it stands to reason, before long, the atmosphere and the morale in that communications center was at an all-time low. And it turned out that things had always been like this at the agency, but no one had ever been called on it. It wasn't until the new manager started holding his people accountable for their actions that he was able to turn things around. So first he started out by having discussions with the trainers, pointing out the bad behavior that was reported to him and that he had observed himself. He laid down ground rules for how people would be treated in the future and pointed to specific general orders of the department that addressed these very same behaviors. He also met with all the other employees and told them that that type of behavior would not be tolerated, and he encouraged them to report it anytime they observed it. And he told all of them that short of physical violence, they were to do whatever was necessary to put an end to the bullying. Now, you know bullying was not unique to this agency then, and it's not unique now. It happens everywhere. And as long as it's allowed to happen, people will continue to do it. But first, someone besides the trainee needs to know it is happening. Trainees and even their coworkers are afraid to say anything for fear of retaliation. So they need to know from the beginning that if they're having any type of problem in their training, they have someone that they can go to. And you need to give them that someone. Okay, mistake number 10, not keeping appropriate documentation. This is a particular pet peeve of mine. Several years ago, I had a trainee who had no business in public safety. She was unable to remember how to do tasks from one day to the next. She couldn't answer questions about things on which she had been trained, and frankly, she was a danger to everyone. So when I went to the lieutenant who was in charge of communications, he transferred her to another shift for another opinion. I'm sure y'all all heard that before. So after completing all 3 shifts with different trainers and with every trainer reporting the same issues, The lieutenant still refused to terminate her, saying that she was the perfect employee. Her husband was a battalion chief, she had no children at home, and she had no reason to call in sick. She was a career woman. It took us 4 years to terminate her, and that was only because we got a new manager who would finally let us do it. Of course, the woman filed a grievance because, after all, she'd been there for 4 years. Why would we suddenly terminate her? Well, we won the grievance because we had so much documentation that the committee could not deny her termination. One of the biggest mistakes trainers make is failing to keep appropriate documentation. And I don't mean just writing down what happened. I mean doing it appropriately. Unfortunately, most trainers and or supervisors don't realize how important documentation is until they're involved in a grievance or a lawsuit. Now, we're all familiar with the DORs. There may be some different versions out there, but they all keep track of the same basic things: attitude, interview, phone, radio, and CAD skills, ability to reason through problems, etc. And most have a grading scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7, and then you have a place to write comments. You may be doing this on paper, or you may be doing it in a program like Guardian Tracking or Adore. But when you document a trainee's performance, what are you actually documenting? I've seen some DORs that say things like, trainee did fine today, slow day. Or trainee worked the radio by himself with very little coaching. Sometimes I would see, trainee needs to work on processing calls more quickly. Really? Well, that's great and all, but what specifically does the trainee need to work on? The DORs should be reflecting in detail what the trainee did that day and what specific improvements need to be made, or what specific actions the trainee took that were outstanding. So proper documentation would include the CAD number or the case number of the call type, what the trainee did that was incorrect, what training or counseling was given for that situation, and the specific expected improvement. If the trainee did something outstanding, the same things apply with the specific great thing that he did. When you document specifics, you have something to fall back on when you have another instance of the same behavior. So say, for instance, on day 3 of their training, you tell the trainee that they have to ask for weapons information on any domestic problem call. On day 5, the trainee takes a domestic problem call but doesn't ask about weapons. Now, you know that you've told her before, but you're going to tell her again to always ask for weapons. On day 17, she again takes a similar call but fails to ask for weapons. Now, you've told her about it, but you didn't specifically state in her DORs until that day that you've had to remind her, quote unquote, numerous times to ask about weapons. If you had to defend yourself in a grievance or a lawsuit, you would be asked, how many times is numerous? Well, you can't answer that because you didn't have it documented. And by now, 3 years have gone by, because you know how the legal system is. So you really can't answer it now. There's a famous saying of mine is, if it ain't writ, it didn't happen. Another thing about documentation, another big pet peeve, is spelling and grammar. I have one piece of sage advice to impart. Spell check is not your friend. You cannot rely on spell check to keep you out of trouble in the DORs. If you are called upon to defend yourself over how you train someone, all the documentation you've ever written will be called into question. And there is nothing worse than a document full of misspelled words and grammatical errors. Check your work. Have someone else check your work, because there's nothing worse than having to sit in front of a committee of directors, managers, and supervisors from other departments while they read that your trainee got the penal code wrong in a call sheet. In no universe is PENILE an acceptable substitute for PENAL. So think about why you're doing the documentation. Is it so you can show that the trainee can do the job, that they understand it, and that they're part of the team? Or are you doing it so you can pass them on saying they've been trained? Your goal for training them is to have a fully functioning coworker. In order to do that, they need to be able to look at their DORs and see what they need to improve on, just as you need to be able to refer back to the DORs to see how they've improved. And you need to be able to defend yourself if for some reason things don't work out. Keep in mind, when you're training your new employee, you're training not only your next coworker, but your best coworker. And their training is a direct reflection of you and your agency. So you need to go forth and train your best. Now, before we go on, I want to invite you to join us next month, August 7th, same bat time, same bat channel, for our next episode of Public Safety Webinars, Texas TERT Hurricane Harvey Telecommunicator Response, How Texas TERT Supported the First Responders, presented by Jason Smith, Operations Supervisor for North Central Texas 911 District. For those of you who know Jason, you know what a good session this will be. So let's answer some questions that have come in. If you have a question but haven't sent it in, go ahead and do that now. Okay, so question 1. We use a lot of abbreviations and acronyms in our DORs and don't always use complete sentences. It's okay to do that, isn't it? Well, we all use abbreviations and acronyms to make things go more quickly, and that's fine as long as it's an abbreviation or an acronym that is commonly understood. But one thing to keep in mind is that call types may change as you go from one CAD to another. So it would be better to spell those out. Like I said, the judicial system does not move quickly, and if you have to go to court to defend yourself after a few years, you may not remember what that code was. Also, I would suggest you never use any type of 10 code, signal, or other code as shorthand. With interoperability, those are definitely going to go away over time, so I would definitely make sure not to use those. Okay, another question. Our shift gets along pretty good, but when someone from another shift works OT on our shift, they bring their bad attitude with them. How am I, as a trainer, supposed to keep that from affecting my trainee? Well, you can't control everything, but if your shift normally gets along until someone with a bad attitude works over, what I suggest is that you change the subject, turn your back and talk to your trainee, or tell the person that you don't want to hear the negativity. The only thing that bad attitude people respond to is extreme peer pressure. So you're a peer, use that pressure. Okay, so those are the only questions that I have so far. If anyone else has another question, go ahead and submit those now. Okay. I don't see any other questions coming up. Well, again, this was brought to you by Commercial Electronics, and you can look at our website at training@comelectronics.com to see what webinars we have coming up next. We do have some very exciting training coming up in the next couple of months that y'all want to pay attention to. A lot of you won't get to hit some of this training at conferences, so you might want to pay attention to that. Otherwise, I want to thank you for joining us, and go forth and train your best coworker.